Pierce. I'm the communications director here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And this is our panel on covering the Capitol. It is our second media panel that we've had. Last year was our first media panel at PO, and this is our second. I was slightly worried that we were going to have a hard sell on this, but we actually got the big room. So that's exciting news that there's a lot of people and a lot of interest in this happening, especially right now as we're at the eve of session. So we have a lot to talk about in only an hour. So we're going to dive right in. I'm going to introduce our panelists today. First off, we have Maggie Glenn, who is the Capitol correspondent for KXAN. But not only is she the Capitol correspondent for KXAN here locally in Austin, but as part of the Next Star Network, her reports reach out all across the state to markets from Amarillo and Lubbock, Abilene, a whole spectrum of places. So she's really bringing the Texas Capitol to the living rooms of Texans all across the state. So she covers the statewide stories for KXAN and Next Star. She is relatively new to Austin in the sense that she started just a year ago. Mm-hmm. And so this is her very first session. We're so excited to have her. She has had a lot to cover this interim, but we'll have a lot to cover, especially in the next 140 days. Then we have Brad Johnson. Brad is a reporter with The Texan, which is a online news publication that was founded by former Senator Connie Burton and is bringing a kind of a fresh perspective to the Texas political scene. He's got a lot of information for us there. Brad, this will be your second session, is that right? No, just your first?
I came in about halfway through the last one, so 1.5.
Yes.
Going through.
So it'll be your first half on that front. And his areas include energy, elections, healthcare, Austin homelessness, and fiscal issues. So nothing very important or urgent going on at the moment. And he graduated from the University of Cincinnati in 2017. We've had some technical difficulties with our other guests, but I want to make sure we've got her connected. Great. We have Taylor Goldenstein, who is the Hearst reporter here in Austin for the Capitol, which means that she is the reporter that is giving information for both the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. She covers the legislature, Attorney General Ken Paxton, and voting rights. So she also has had quite the interim and many things to cover. In 2014, she was the visiting fellow for the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University, and she previously reported to the Austin American-Statesman, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and Tampa Bay Times. And despite the fact that Taylor is relatively young, she has a wealth of experience. So as our veteran reporter, Taylor, if you don't mind, if you would kick us off for this first question, the big one, the obvious one, what is the big story that you're looking for this session?
I think it's two things, and I answer that with two. I think obviously everyone's looking out for the budget. That's going to be a big deal this year with coronavirus taking up a lot of discussion. We have a $1 billion deficit we're looking at, which is better than the $4 billion deficit that we were expecting this summer, but still going to be difficult. And then, secondly, obviously coronavirus, what will happen with CARES Act money that still has to be doled out, and how the state will continue to roll out the vaccine and things like that.
So Brad, as our next most senior Capitol correspondent, what stories do you have your eye on?
For me, the biggest one is the emergency powers. We've seen the governor exercise near carte blanche power during the last year. The legislature had basically zero ability to check that authority. And we've seen a bevy of legislation proposed, filed already. One that sticks out to me is by Representative Brooks Landgraf. That would prevent a disaster declaration from being extended beyond 60 days without, say from the legislature, in an instance wherein the 75% of the state is under disaster order. So there's a multitude of other ones, but really the emergency powers for me is probably the biggest one.
All right, Maggie, you're our television guru. What story are you particularly tracking right now?
Well, both of the issues that both of my other cohorts mentioned are definitely going to be top of mind, but then another thing we're going to be focusing on too are kind of pandemic response legislation. So looking at different things involving healthcare that can range from, expanding broadband for telehealth for our rural communities. That's something that we really try to focus on, just because you and I were just talking about before. Sometimes our rural communities don't get as much coverage as they should. And so telehealth is something that was, expanded during the pandemic. We're going to be looking at bills that are looking to extend that expansion, and also just kind of looking at, again, expanding broadband across the state as well. So lots of healthcare and kind of COVID response legislation, I feel, is going to be really top of mind for us too.
Taylor, you kicked us off talking about the budget, which I think is probably the number one thing that most people are looking at. It is the only bill that the legislature must pass, though I think in maybe a redistricting year that they do need to pass that as well. But the comptroller came out on Monday with what someone characterized as a fairly optimistic take on the biannual revenue estimate. What was your take when you saw those numbers, and what's some of the reaction that you're seeing?
I think it was definitely a sigh of relief for a lot of people. I mean, coming down for this summer, it seemed pretty dire. And especially at that point too, we didn't know where the recovery was headed. I think, that combined with knowing that the vaccine is already starting to get to people, I think puts us in a much better position.
So how do you think that's going to affect the narrative as we go along and as we're looking at budget stories?
Well, there's still school financing to account for and all of that. So the lawmakers will have to make room somehow to continue to fund that bill, on top of everything else that they're considering. So I don't think by any means it's going to be easy, but definitely, like you said, it'll be more positive.
Do you think that there is an opening for maybe more legislation, more stories that the budget won't become the dominant narrative, or do you think that's still going to be the number one thing people are talking about?
I think it kind of meshes with everything we're talking about here. It meshes with, how coronavirus will be handled. It meshes with how school finance will be handled. There had been a lot of, when it was looking more dire this summer, I think there was more hope for some of these, maybe more creative solutions for bringing in revenue. We saw, marijuana legalization proposals that are out there. We've seen, casino gambling expansion. It sounds right now like that might not be as necessary. Maybe that's one side effect of a more positive outlook. And this week, Speaker Phelan spoke to the Texas Tribune and kind of threw water on some of those ideas, saying he didn't think that they were likely to have a long-term impact. So
it's pretty definitive when the speaker says we don't have the votes and leaves it
right.
at that. So, Brad, you were most interested in the emergency powers, which is, of course, related to all of the other things, which comes budget, COVID, everything intertwined in that story. What is it that speaks to you most about emergency powers? Why do you feel that is the most important story for you to cover?
Well, the Texas Disaster Act was passed in 1975, and it was shopped around by the Council of State Governments and under the pretense of these regional disasters. And that is essentially the way the legislature operated with this law for 40 years. Obviously now things are different. We have an entire state under disaster order, and that is profoundly different. I see a ton of appetite on both sides of the aisle to address this. I mentioned Representative Landgraf's bill. Numerous other Republicans have as well. Representative Rafael Anchia also introduced a bill related to this. So I see a real opportunity for them to gather a lot of support and push through some sort of reform. I don't know what that'll be, but it also, depending on what it is, might require veto-proof majority because it would go against human nature for the governor to go along with restricting his authority. And so that would be one reason why likely that he did not call them into session along with the public health concerns of gathering. So I see a lot of support for this on both sides of the aisle, and I think it has a real shot.
And the emergency powers wouldn't necessarily just be a story about the highest levels of government. It would also maybe focus on local entities as well.
Yep, and within the Texas Disaster Act, it grants, this was actually, I believe, a 1987 amendment that gave a lot more authority to these local officials, and that is exactly what you're talking about. These cities, take the city of Austin with the whole bar situation over New Year's Eve. That stems from that section of the Disaster Act, and I'm not sure. I'm less convinced that that would go anywhere, more so on a broad statewide level, but who knows?
Taylor, the disaster declaration and the emergency powers that come with that, those were not in your first or second, but is that a story that you're watching as well?
Definitely a story we're watching.
And what about the property tax element that comes into that, where maybe we're not talking about broad powers like the ability to shut down businesses or to create quarantines, but the property tax loophole? Is that something that either any of you are looking at? And just a refresher to our audience, that is the loophole that under disaster declaration, that the property tax limits that were set in the last session about the amount that property tax revenue could increase, a cap, if you will, that can be sidestepped during a disaster. And I don't think anyone anticipated that we'd be in a setting right now for that to already be such a loophole. Any interest in that story?
I would think so. I mean, I think this year it was very unclear, and we saw kind of the gamut of things. Some counties that interpreted it to mean, yes, a pandemic as a disaster, and others that didn't. I know Senator Betancourt was saying he didn't think it should be. So yeah, I can definitely see that being something that they'll want to clarify.
If I could add to that, this is something I've covered quite a bit, and it goes back to that theme of the original intent focused on these regional areas, and obviously now we have this new situation statewide. And you mentioned Senator Betancourt, Representative Burrows. They both opposed it. They suggested, I haven't talked to them in the last couple months, but they suggested the idea of somehow passing a law that would reprimand these cities that are passing these increases up to 8%, the previous threshold. I find most interesting about this, though, especially if you're interested in conservative legal arguments, that there's a dichotomy here between original intent of the law and the textualist reading of it. And Senator Betancourt's main argument, Attorney General Paxton echoed this, was that that applies to physical damage. Take Hurricane Harvey. But the text of the law does not specify that at all. And which rules here? I don't know. That would be something the mostly conservative Supreme Court of Texas would have to rule on, but it poses an interesting dynamic.
Maggie, as a television reporter, you have a couple of minutes to help people kind of come to grips with some very complicated stories, right? Emergency powers, property taxes. How are you going to approach some of these more difficult, very meaty subject matters that we policy wonks love and live for, but you're trying to translate that for people in their living rooms, in their kitchens, while they're making dinner? Do you have a kind of an idea of how you're going to go about that?
Yeah, so this actually is kind of how we start off each of our meetings every single morning, whether it be session or whether it be just, any kind of day-to-day story, is how do we tell this in a way that provides the most value to our viewer? We assess stories based on viewer value. So a lot of these things, while the lawmakers themselves are going to pay a lot of attention to them, if they're not going to be providing our average viewer at home a lot of insight, or doesn't provide them with something, with knowledge that they need, we're not going to pay a whole lot of attention to it. We're still going to cover it. We're still going to either do a web story on it, or make sure it's included in our coverage. But our main focus is going to be the issues that Texans want to know about, that's going to be affecting them on a day-to-day basis. So we try to open stories up with kind of a personal angle. So we try to find characters that are personally affected by different issues, whether it be healthcare, whether it be, when we talk about the budget, like Taylor was mentioning, that was at the top of our list heading into session. That's like our number one, pretty much everyone's number one priority this session. But how do we tell budget stories in a way to actually make people pay attention and make people kind of care? And so talking about the budget, that could be directly tied into, taking a look at how we're going to get our economy going again coming out of this pandemic, and that directly ties in with vaccine rollout. So you kind of try to find ways to just kind of mesh everything together and to make sure that you're adding value to your viewers' lives.
You tap into an important aspect, which is deciding what stories to cover. And obviously, I think that's something that is always contentious, but maybe especially contentious in the last few years. And then as we're looking at the shifting media landscape, whether that's the Texan or social media or different aspects of how people are getting their news, and this is for anyone who wants to answer, how do you determine what is that story that is valuable to your reader, that your reader needs to know about?
I think for us personally, we do get a lot of feedback constantly. We're constantly, KXAN's website has a section called Report It. So, when we're getting a lot of Report It's about whether it be Texas Workforce Commission complaints or vaccine rollout complaints, we kind of, first of all, take a look at what the people are telling us, what they need help with. That's definitely number one on our list. But then we're also just kind of evaluating major changes that could be on the way. And again, just kind of trying to take a look at what issues impact our viewers the most.
Taylor, the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News, two large national papers with a lot of prominence. And so how are you kind of sifting through what that story looks like, what stories you're picking, what stories you're telling?
Right. I think it's kind of a balance, what's going to appeal to everyone statewide, and then what are some of the issues that are unique to our coverage areas. So, last session, unexpectedly, there was the ITC fire, for example. We didn't know that was coming, but when that happened, that was actually a big point of discussion during the ledge to figure out, how they were going to try to prevent something like that again. So things like that, we're just always looking out for.
And so when you hear criticism about stories that are covered or the way that they're covered, how do you kind of take that in, and does that affect your reporting?
Yeah, I personally am always open to any kind of constructive criticism. If someone's coming to me and, has an honest criticism, I think it's, in our best interest to always be looking to improve. And we're human and we do our best to do unbiased work. But, sometimes, you have to, fight against, your human urges to, not be on center. So, it's great to have readers who reach out to us and, we pay attention to feedback. It's important.
Brett, the Texan was established as a publication that is maybe telling some different stories. What does that newsroom discussion look like about deciding what you're going to cover?
Well, obviously what our readers care about, we are a subscription-based publication, and so the buck stops there. If they care about a story, we write about it. Barring, problems with bandwidth, that kind of thing. So it really, really starts and stops there. I'd also add that, the stuff that doesn't get reported by the mainstream media, we usually, tend to jump at that. For example, these sanctuary cities for the unborn. I haven't covered any of that. A couple of my colleagues have done a very good job. And they've followed up with every instance since. And that's something, other than the Washington Post taking an opportunity to dunk on them for that, that's not something that gets out there in relatively nonpartisan, unbiased way. And so my colleagues have done that, and that's just one example of that, the type of story we go for.
Great. So originally this panel was largely about what's going to be on the plate for legislators, what you're going to be covering as the big stories. I think after last week, we would be remiss to not talk about media and the trust. Brett, you used the phrase mainstream media, which is something that gets tossed around a lot. And I think sometimes we like to think about ourselves as being slightly different here, right? Covering the State House is different than covering the Capitol. But clearly there are issues with trust. Americans with mainstream media, with other forms of media. And I think it would be naive to say that there aren't issues with Texans and having trust with where they're getting their information from and where, can they rely on media, whether it's mainstream or new or a different take, that they don't always know what they can trust or not trust. How is that, A, do you sense that here on a state level? And then B, how does that inform the way that you're approaching your stories?
I'll take a stab at this one first. I think that this kind of notion of, I'll just kind of label it as you kind of see in social media, the fake news media, right? I think that term gets thrown around a lot without really kind of taking a look at what people mean when they say it. I think that your local news stations are doing just, they're doing the work as a journalist that we signed up to do. We're trying to keep people accountable, whether that be lawmakers, city council members, whatever it may be. We really don't have an agenda, because you always hear about the agenda of the media. And I also challenge people, because working in Amarillo before I came here to Austin, Amarillo was there was definitely more distrust for the media in general in Amarillo than there was here in Austin. And it would be interesting for me, because I would be talking to just a random stranger in public who would say like, oh, hey, I recognize you. And then they say something along the lines of like, well, I usually don't trust the media, but like, you're okay. And I wanted to be like, but we all have the same kind of, goal. We want to inform the public, and we want to do that in the most factual and unbiased way as possible. And so I know that pretty much any local news journalist that I've talked to in TV, we all have the same goal. And that, again, I'm going to keep drilling this home, is just to make sure our viewers are informed and have kind of all points of view that they need. So my colleagues and I, we will never just run a story with one perspective. We try to make sure that we always include both sides, or multiple sides if there are multiple sides. And I think that's really important for people to know. And I also would like to add that I think the whole problem with the media stems a lot from social media as well, because people will just kind of retweet whatever they see. They'll repost without really looking at what they're reposting, and without really vetting who they're reposting. So I think that's kind of something that people should be evaluating too.
I think that's all correct. I would say that if there wasn't a problem with the media, I use the term mainstream for lack of a better term, but really, there's, like, an economy is not one uniform thing. The media is not one uniform thing either. But if there wasn't a trust problem, I would not have a job right now. I would not be sitting up here. I would not have moved to Texas. I think reporters especially need to recognize that fact, and it's not all their fault. It's not all the media's fault. Individuals are culpable as well. But I would say that one example of this issue happened yesterday here. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick was at the keynote, and he was quoting a Nancy Pelosi tweet about how the 2016 election was illegitimate. And then, 2 minutes later, he said something about how he's not among the people who thinks the election was stolen. And a reporter just quoted those two things and how they're posed against each other and not conducive, and didn't add any of the context, for example, that he was quoting Nancy Pelosi. We see this play out constantly, and I find it frankly pretty strange that nobody, or very few people, have actually come to grips with there is a trust issue. And there's a trust issue with us too. Like, we had to gain people's trust. We were a fledgling news organization, and I would like to think we've gained at least some people's trust, and I think that's a testament to me still being here. But so it's really strange to me that especially national media can look at this situation. Chris Cuomo sit up there and say, where in the Constitution does it say protests have to be peaceful? Well, Chris, in the First Amendment, it literally says that. Especially when you have those soundbite-driven incentives, it falls down poorly on the rest of the media. It falls down poorly on Maggie, even though she doesn't cover the same stuff that Chris Cuomo does, likely doesn't jump at the same kind of stuff, and provides far more in-depth coverage. But it's a systemic problem in the media, and like I said, it's not just their fault. It is also the individuals that hold some culpability there, but it should be recognized.
Taylor, you have anything you want to add, especially as someone who's, I guess, most closely aligned with traditional media?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of on, work needs to be done on both ends. On our end, there's a lot we can do to build trust, telling the stories that, people, are looking for and want to be told, and, making sure that when we make mistakes that there's accountability and we're completely upfront and transparent about it, because mistakes do happen, and making sure that the record is corrected. And then on the other side, it's a little bit of what Maggie said of, encouraging people to diversify their news sources and make sure that where they're getting their information is from legitimate sources that, take their information from, like I said, legitimate places, as opposed to the social media post that went viral but has no sources cited.
If I could add something there too, there's a real problem on the right as well. There are a lot of publications that traffic in conspiracies, and it is just as important for conservatives, Republicans, those on the right to fight back against those, just as it is for the legacy outlets to fight against the internal bias. So there's more than enough blame to go around here.
Right, I appreciate that moment of introspection, both for the left and the right. And I think we can all kind of establish that as journalists who we work with, who call to a conservative think tank and ask for our opinions, ask for our thoughts, that you as individuals are definitely doing good work. But kind of broadening from that introspection to a series of looking out into your industry as a whole, I'm kind of curious, lay people look and they see, and they're frustrated with the media, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, and they're frustrated with the stories that are told or stories that aren't told, or the perspective or context that may be left out. And so while you're trying individually your best to tell the whole story and tell the truth every day, as a member of the media, do you look at your industry and sometimes feel frustration about what others are doing and how they're approaching some of the biggest stories of the day?
Yes, unequivocally yes. I get frustrated every day. For example, there was a Texas-based example. Sheriff Wayborn up in Tarrant County was at the White House. I think this was last year or 2019. And he made a comment that was construed as calling illegal immigrants drunks and people who will run over your family. And what he was talking about were the individuals who happened to be illegal immigrants that had DWIs, and I think a couple of them actually ran people over. So, but it was taken and run with by a legacy outlet, and it's just flat out false. And we looked at that, and all you had to do was watch the tape. It was not difficult, but once this narrative gets out there, it's got to grow its own legs and runs, and it's very difficult to put that cat back in the bag.
Taylor is someone who has been in a number of the largest and most prestigious newsrooms in the nation, and definitely has a level of traditional media and legacy there. What does your experience inform you when you're watching the news yourself?
I mean, I can only speak to the colleagues that I've worked with, but I think everyone I've worked with, has the same perspective of, we're here to tell the whole story, and like Maggie said, get both sides when there are both, two sides to a story. And, like I said, I can't speak for places I haven't worked, but, I do think that is the goal of all of us is to build that trust.
So I completely appreciate that, and the sense of wanting to only speak for the firsthand experience that you've had. Do you ever see a news story and you wonder, how did that come to be, or what were they thinking? Is that something that, knowing a little bit about how the sausage is made, how the things work, you're still startled by any kind of stories that you just wouldn't have approached that way, or maybe your colleagues in the past wouldn't have approached in a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we all know, with the internet being such a big part of, news now, it is a choice that we're making of, are you going to be fastest or are you going to be right? And, hopefully you're fastest and right. That's the goal. I think we run into problems when there's so much desire to be fastest that, some of the details get lost in the way. And from what I've seen, that doesn't happen often, thankfully, but when it does, yeah, it's disappointing to see, because I know it's going to affect not just their readers, but our readers as a whole. So it's just something we have to be aware of.
So we're going to continue this discussion for a little bit longer, but I know that a number of you are probably itching with some questions, and I want to let you know that we're going to discuss for about 15 more minutes, and then you will have the opportunity to ask the askers some questions. And so just want to make sure that you were prepared and ready for that. So, we've kind of talked about that there are issues in the media. There's definitely, unquestionably, trust issues, right? That Americans don't know where they can get their news from, whether that is the media's fault or the social media's fault or whatever the case may be. It is what's happening in the world right now. And there's discussions about like how do we introspectively look at things and change things, and yet that doesn't seem to be completely working, right? We continue to be in some of the same issues that we've had decade after decade. So it looks like people are looking for more solutions. One of them would be AOC in Congress, who yesterday made a proposal that Congress should be looking at media and helping to rein in and prevent misinformation and disinformation. I think I know what y'all might feel about that, but I'd love your hot takes. Maggie, why don't we start with you?
Right. Well, I think that starts kind of down a little bit of a dangerous path, because the whole reason, that we are journalists is again, like I mentioned earlier, to keep people accountable, and that includes our lawmakers. So just kind of reacting to that makes me a little bit nervous, but I personally haven't really taken a whole look at what her proposal is, so I'll kind of stop it there.
All right, great. Brad, do you have a thought?
Yeah, well, it takes me back about 100 years to the Committee on Public Information instituted by Woodrow Wilson during the war. I would almost guarantee you that this committee, should it be put in place, it would have far more bark than bite, unlike the reverse with the CPI back.
And why do you say that it would have more bark than bite?
Well, committees in general, especially in DC, they do a lot of deliberation, which is, of course, the role of a legislative body, or at least part of it. But we have these grandiose committees that we have so much testimony and not much comes of it. Plus, I have a feeling that there is not a lot of appetite in any quarter of the legislature other than her wing for that kind of thing. I think Democrats who would be assumed to jump on board with this, I think far more would not. But, I focus on state politics more, so I'll leave that to people in federal.
So what I'm hearing from you is that you're not too, while the idea may be radical, you're not too worried about it in and of itself.
Well, I think it sets a very, very dangerous precedent. And who knows, maybe this gets instituted, and at first it's not that plenary, but it could go further and further. If that becomes normalized, then, increasing its power falls closer within the Overton window. And so obviously I think it's a very bad idea, and everyone should oppose that. Because first of all, who is to decide who is a journalist? Journalism is not explicitly a job description. It is within the Constitution. It's in the First Amendment. Anybody can be a journalist. Now, you may disagree with their methods. They certainly have been caught in some lies, but Project Veritas, that's an example of a different kind of journalism. And it's more, people with a cell phone, that kind of thing, recording what is going on. That is also journalism. And it may be bad journalism, but it is journalism. And if we get into this process of the government dictating what is journalism and what is not, we're in for a rough road.
Taylor, any concerns specifically about what AOC is proposing and saying that is actually being discussed amongst congressional members?
I would agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said, and just kind of add that it also possibly, lays almost all the blame in that case almost on journalists, as if, we don't have a huge job, all of us, to make sure that media literacy is something we really focus on, from a young age, for everybody to know.
So 3 out of 3 say not a good idea for government to decide what is going to be legitimate or what constitutes media literacy. So I guess the question left then is, well, what do we do, right? We're certainly not here, no surprise that we're not endorsing a plan from AOC, but what is the alternative? How can credibility be brought back to the media landscape?
I think that it kind of falls on all of us as journalists to kind of just keep doing the work that we are doing, you know, making sure that we're telling all sides of the story, but then also doing just kind of increasing public awareness about what is a credible news source and what isn't, and what you can kind of do to go through and make sure what you're reading, you're getting the full perspective. You're not just getting one side of things. And like Taylor mentioned before, that includes diversifying the news that you're reading. That means reading from, you know, all spectrums of news. And I think that it also takes making sure you read the fine print, because even with major news outlets, you could be reading an op-ed that's an op-ed that has nothing, you know, factual to it. But if you take that as facts, then, you know, you're misinforming yourself. So I think it kind of just takes some hard work and just kind of making sure people, I don't know, just earning the trust back.
Sure. So, you know, that definitely puts a lot of onus on the readers, on the consumers themselves. In an age when we have so much media to consume, when there's so many outlets, it's impossible to investigate or to know every story. What responsibility does the media bear in what they put out? Taylor or Brad, you want to take that?
Well, a lot. I mean, you know, each of us puts our name to the stories we publish, and if something is incorrect or errant, then, you know, that's a hit to our credibility. You know, going through every motion possible to make sure you have everything right, and everybody makes mistakes. It's one thing to make a mistake, own up to it, and fix it. It's a whole other thing to pretend that large swaths of issues do not apply. For example, when talking about healthcare, there is this hyper-focus on insurance coverage, and that is definitely something that must be talked about when it comes to healthcare. But there are all these other aspects that are never discussed, or very rarely discussed. You know, one we're seeing more now because of coronavirus, the telehealth stuff that you mentioned earlier. That's an example of another aspect of healthcare, this insanely complicated issue that is, until this year, very largely ignored. You have this rising movement of direct primary care doctors who have been using that for years. And you know, until I started this job, started talking to people that are knowledgeable on the subject, I had never heard of that. So you know, it goes back to really trying to making sure you have all of the facts, getting different perspectives and nuanced perspectives.
So a number of people who are watching this, especially digitally, are their staff members who work for Member, maybe members themselves, activists who want to tell stories. What do they need to know from you about how to get their story covered, or how to, if they have a problem with something that you've written, that they have an issue, maybe you got a fact wrong, maybe you missed some context, what can they do to make sure that gets corrected? Taylor, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, I think it's all about relationships. You know, when we have good relationships with sources, that just makes it all the more easy to, you know, like you said, work through issues like that. And I know, you know, myself and most of us have open door policies. You know, call anytime, and we always want to know right away if there's anything that you think might be wrong or might even need a clarification. You know, my first thought is you know, to check on that and make sure that's you know, if that's something that needs to happen, it happens right away, because, you know, it is so important to us. You know, having the thought of having something out there that's incorrect is, you know, I you know, I grind my teeth at night about it, you know, thinking about it. So it's important.
Do you have relationships with activists or grassroots leaders or different, or, you know, elected members that do call you, that you're actually having those conversations with? Yeah,
Senator Betancourt texted me earlier this week on something. I think it's good to have that kind of relationship where someone feels comfortable coming to you and telling you when they feel like something's not right. It's not, we don't always immediately say, yes, that needs to be corrected, because sometimes, it is factually correct, and, people might have, issue with maybe how it was perceived or something like that. So I can't guarantee that something will come out of it, but it's definitely a conversation, and it's a conversation I always want to have.
Maggie, telling your story largely on television, you don't always have the same luxury to reflect on a story or maybe change the online edition. How do you approach some of that, making sure that you're getting it right, or when someone pushes back on the context, or that you maybe told it in a way that wasn't quite what was meant? How do you take care of that?
Right. So I will say that, it can be difficult. We have a minute and 15 seconds to wrap up a whole story. So my colleagues and I, we're always super careful that even if we are choosing a shorter soundbite that doesn't include the full idea, that we're not misconstruing the idea that whoever we're speaking to is trying to convey. And I will say we always do expand in the web story itself, in the web article. We'll include more context, more quotes, and that kind of thing. But same with what Taylor was saying, anytime anyone has an issue with something that was published, we're always totally open to listening, and if they are correct, then we do make those changes. But yeah, we're always open to feedback.
Do you have an example of maybe when you either corrected a story or came back, and maybe the next time you were talking about that, you made sure to get it right, to nail it that time?
I will say from my personal experience that hasn't happened, but I do know of a colleague who just, there was a kind of a confusion with a medical story, and one of the doctors was a little bit upset about the way that her quote was construed. So then it was just as simple as adding a couple more quotes into the web story to make sure that her position was really clear, so that everyone would be happy.
Great. We have just a couple more minutes before we go into question and answer. So we've talked about the big stories that you have on your plates that you're definitely looking at. I don't think they're a surprise to anyone. There are a lot of the things that we're talking about here at Policy Orientation. What is maybe an undercover story that people who are here should be watching and looking at? Like, what is this sort of thing that no one saw coming, maybe the coronavirus of 2021, that starts off small, could be an issue, and something no one's thinking about, but then become a dominant narrative for us in this upcoming session? And Taylor, if you don't mind, since you're our veteran, I'm going to kick off with you.
Oh my goodness. The first one I thought of is maybe not what you're thinking of, and something that people have been talking about, and even the governor's been talking about a lot. But I think alcohol to go, obviously I didn't foresee the pandemic coming at all, but I definitely didn't foresee alcohol to go being such a big deal, and something that everyone can get around no matter what side of the aisle you're on. So it's just kind of a funny one, but I need to think a little bit more to think of other surprising ones.
Great. If you think of something, let me know, and we'll circle back on that. But Margarita's always bringing Texans together, for sure. Brett, do you have it, especially since your outlet is covering a lot of stories that might traditionally not be covered or that could be overlooked? Do you have a story in mind?
Well, I cover a lot of Austin, and especially the homelessness / police stuff. I would have said the tax loophole, but I'm going to go with the potential overtaking of Austin Police Department from the state. Who saw that? Who saw that coming?
Yeah, and just for our listeners, tell us a little bit more about what that is.
The Governor Abbott has suggested, because of the various arguments with Austin City Council and Steve Adler, the mayor, of kind of taking under the state's wing, under the Department of Public Safety's wing, the police department, and especially it came from the $150 million budget cut and redirection that they did from their police department budget. That's what really set it off. But this has been going on. This has been stewing for years. It started back with the PR bond ordinance that the city council issued. It continued with the homelessness rescission, and it continues to this day with the police department budget cut. So I'm not sure how he's going to do it, but it's certainly going to be interesting to watch.
Maggie, fresh perspective, first session. What is your story that maybe people who've been around the Capitol for a time or two wouldn't think to look for?
Well, we actually did have this conversation in our own newsroom, and like Taylor mentioned, we think the alcohol to go thing is definitely going to be just a big talker. And then also, before the pandemic hit, people were saying that they really thought this would be the session for marijuana reform, whether it comes to our medical marijuana program or the legalization of marijuana. But, kind of looking at all of the grander issues, there's just no way of knowing if lawmakers will actually have time for the kind of, the issues that get a lot of talk in the public, but really we just might not have time for them with so many other things on our plate.
Absolutely. All right, it is question and answer time, and we are thankful for these journalists who are happy to have the tables turned on them and to have questions sent to them. So anyone want to start us off with a question? I will bet right here. And as a reminder, please speak in the microphone because it is being live streamed, so they cannot hear you unless you're speaking into the microphone. And remember to keep it to a question, not a statement with a punctuation at the end.
So I actually work for a direct primary care, so thanks for the plug, by the way. So healthcare, as you said, it's incredibly complicated. I'm just kind of curious what strategies you on the panel have for talking about something so complicated when you only have a certain amount of time to go through it, or so many words that you can explain your message.
Well, I think it starts with actively seeking out those alternative perspectives. For example, the direct primary care doctors, we have this tendency to hyper-focus on this hospital system, which of course amounts to the broad array of our healthcare system, but the opportunities for reform often come, and this extends beyond healthcare, from these little guys fighting to stay afloat. And great example of that is the telehealth. And we've seen that become adopted by the mainstream healthcare industry. So as far as coverage, at least coverage of the issue, that is where I first go, look for into these little nook and crannies for these weird odds and ends of effectively policy that these businesses have implemented. And then obviously checking with the conglomerates, the hospitals, and trying to get as many perspectives as possible. But also, because healthcare is so complicated, you have to do it, one minutia at a time. And you can't, it's very difficult. I learned this, I did this series on the status of Texas healthcare, and I had to, my original draft was 5,000 words. And obviously that had to be cut up into 3 different things, but that's just how complicated this is. And I didn't even touch on many aspects of healthcare because I couldn't. And that, you got to think, that is what a consumer feels when they go and they have to buy healthcare. How is that approachable? How are these regulations, upon regulations, making it easier for them to find healthcare and to actually get what they want? I think you find a lot of tearing through those in these little platoons, basically, that are operating on their own.
Right. Down here in the front.
Okay, so we had Governor DeSantis here today. As journalists, he is in a state where we are all, like right now in this room, we're supposed to be wearing masks and we have to be socially distanced, and we basically have various levels of lockdowns occurring right now in the state of Texas. And he just championed how his state has actually lower cases without any mandates whatsoever, and they're free in Florida, and we're not in Texas. And he was in our house saying that on the governor's alma mater's campus. Do you think that's newsworthy to talk about at this point, and that he thinks that beer to go is somehow more important than getting rid of these executive overreach? And it was interesting to me that Governor DeSantis said that he wants to be on board with making sure that an executive can't do this, even though he's the governor and had to initially do some of that, that he wants to be on board with his legislature to work alongside them to restrain that, because he doesn't know who might be in next. And so where's our governor? Are you going to ask him about it? Are you going to ask him? Is he like DeSantis? Is he going to work with the legislature to restrain the executive's overreach here? Is he even willing to admit that?
Great. Tough question about some tough questions.
I think
I think in the House, we have some sense of how that might go just based on what we've heard from Speaker Phelan this week. He, spoke when he was first elected this week and said that he thinks that the emergency powers did great things for his district during Hurricane Harvey, and that he feels there's a lot of value. So, I mean, I don't know how discussion will go, but that's at least one representation of the House's take on it. I don't know. It'll definitely be a big issue this session. I'm not sure which way it'll go.
I would say, yeah, he should be asked that. And I can't remember the last time I was in a presser with the governor because the COVID protocols, they've been limited and whatnot. At one point, they just had a pool of reporters. But I would say providing that other perspective, for example, my colleague Daniel, who's here, he has been covering the numbers, providing all the context in great detail. And if you don't provide that, people don't know how to navigate the DSHS website. They don't know when they look at a chart what the heck that means. So for speaking for ourselves, like we've provided that coverage. And as far as the overreach, like I said in the first section, I find it hard to believe that he is going to go along with something that restricts his own authority. Who knows? Maybe he will. But to echo what Taylor said, also, Phelan did say that Speaker Phelan said that he is not really supportive of that. So that is a barrier to what I mentioned first about this broad support for reform. So I don't know.
All right, I want to make sure are there any more questions right now? Maggie, kind of going on that, the question about asking tough questions, the case specifically about COVID restrictions, but you come with a camera, right? You're coming in and you are recording what they say. So there's not, you can edit, you can do some things, but like what they say is going to come up. How do you make that decision when you're going to ask a tough question? And not just the question that maybe their communications director wants you to ask. How do you hold politicians and activists and any kind of person who's holding any kind of power, how do you hold them accountable in that question process?
I think it takes a couple different things to think about. First of all, you have to think about how many questions you're going to be given. So if you are given 15 full minutes to ask whatever you need to, you're not just going to be asking the hard questions, but you're also going to be, kind of wanting to know what they want to convey to you before asking those kind of harder questions. But when we have limited access to the governor, like you mentioned, there's been so many COVID protocols, which are understandable, but we haven't had that many opportunities to really kind of ask those tough questions. So when we are granted the time, granted we might be only given the time to ask one or two questions, that's really when we have to capitalize and ask the questions that they might not want to answer, but we're kind of just forcing them to a little bit.
What happens when you ask the question and they respond, but the answer isn't always maybe a complete response to the initial question that you posed?
I think you just have to kind of weigh what their answer is. If it's just a complete no comment, then I usually follow that up with, well, can you give me anything here, or is there a reason you're not going to comment? If it's pending litigation, that's an obvious reason. But if they give kind of a nuanced answer where it's kind of dancing around the actual question, I'll just find another way to ask the question again until I get a more straightforward answer.
Taylor, as someone who has been covering very high-level individuals, how do you kind of strike that balance of trying to, this is something you're going to cover on an ongoing basis, but there's a story unfolding now that needs answers now. How do you walk that line?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of what Maggie said, persistence, asking questions in different ways, asking follow-ups when possible. And then if you're just talking about in general, having to go up to someone for the hard questions, I think it helps if you're, if you're doing your job right, you're covering everything that's going on, and hopefully not every story you're coming to them with, it's going to make them nervous or it's going to have a terribly difficult question related to it. So, as long as you've been doing your job right, I think that hopefully your sources understand it's part of your job and they take it in stride.
Great. We've got a question coming up here from someone who definitely knows a little bit about media and discussions with the press, our Chief Communications Officer, Brian Phillips.
Yeah, thank you all for being and participating in this panel. This has been great. Just a quick question for each of you. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you change about your industry? Either to make your job easier or to make you more respected or, along those lines. And you can't use something easy like higher income.
That's a good question. I would say for me, it would be the ability to make communications directors or PIOs get back to you within an hour of your
They
question.
actually kind of have something like that in Florida.
That would be great.
Yeah.
But
That's why
yeah.
you see all these crazy Florida man articles.
Right, but yeah, I would say just because we do have some media communications directors that we're in contact with that are fabulous, and always get back to us on our deadline. But especially there are some state agencies who take days to get back to us, and if we were able to just get the questions we need, especially before our 5 o'clock story airs, that would be amazing, and we could do a lot more.
I would say that the entire industry realizes that we are not the story. There are many very good reporters in this country, in this state, and you have a handful of people, especially at the top, but also scattered throughout, that believe themselves to be the story, and that is not the case. That's not how it's supposed to be, and it really yields itself to terrible work. I use the example Chris Cuomo. Everything is about him when he's on TV, and that is not indicative of the average reporter, but that's what people see, and then that creates this PR problem, this trust issue that is permeating the industry right now.
Right, let me push back on that just a tiny bit, because I agree with you on the idea of not being the story as being the star. But what about right now when media and trust in the media is part of the story, right? When am I trustworthy? Are these sources valid? Can the American people sort through the information and its factuality? What about when that is part of the story?
Well, I'd say there's a difference between asking hard questions and making sure they hear your hard questions, and grandstanding in order to get a book deal. Those things are very obvious to tell between. You can tell that the honest reporters who really need to ask this question, and good on them for doing so. As far as when the media becomes a story, I believe there's this whole cottage industry of media reporters that has developed, and some of them do good work, some of them do bad work.
Taylor, what about your magic wand?
I think there's a big difference between Chris Cuomo and what we do, but yeah. I guess I would just say, I was going to say more funding, but that feels like a cop-out answer. I think I'll go with just better representation in the media, more editors that are women and people of color. I think would do a lot to help us with coverage that people are looking for, that have in the past been overlooked or not covered as well as it should be.
On that point, Taylor, I think this would be interesting for our audience. Do you think that in addition to having demographic diversity, that there should also be ideological diversity as well in your editors?
It's hard to answer because, that's not something we discuss. And it's generally actually the opposite. We try not to discuss that. So I'm not really sure, even if that were a goal, how that would even be accomplished, other than maybe surveying people you hire. But either way, the goal is that no matter where you stand personally, you're able to set that aside. So I would say the problem would be if you're really not able to do that.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we will wrap things up. It's been a great panel, and I really appreciate our journalists coming out here. And one thing I heard today is that journalism is a two-way street, right? That it's very easy to be angry at media on a one-way street. And so what our journalist friends have told us here today is that it can be a two-way street, that you can talk back, that you can share constructive criticism, and I think that's something that we can all hold each other accountable to. So thank you so much for joining us today.